Hello, my friends again. We're today covering the framing bias and anchoring bias, as I was promising you before. And I always start with this, because we're not rational creatures and we have a lot of biases, literally hundreds of psychologically tested cognitive biases that now probably exist not as biases, but filters in our brain. And that's how we perceive the information. The two ones covered today related to the presented information and how we filter the information presented to make a decision. So literally lots of biases. These ones are quite important. Again, difference between the bias and noise from latest book by Daniel Kahneman. And I think the bias is consistently a wrong piece of, consistently being off the mark rather than just a randomness. And how does that happen? Well, it probably would happen randomly if it happens different people with different anchoring in this particular case. But here, the information in the anchoring basically is the first one that comes to mind when people give too much importance to the first piece of the information they learn. So, for example, if you would use kind of the first piece of information about a person, saying, well, he's good and so on, you kind of framed it, but you also anchored the person towards that. But there's other facts about that person that you haven't yet heard. But the first thing is highly influential. It is extremely prevalent in all people, can be affected by completely arbitrary information. It's something that leads to poor judgment, and it's exceptionally well common in the interviews, during the project work, during the introduction, and the dating, of course, in a dating scene. It's quite important. So what you present and how you present yourself for the first date basically determines everything. So is it a bias? Yes, it is a bias because it doesn't really consider all information, but that's how we operate. That's how humans operate. That's how people select their loved ones on the first date, the anchoring. So, and people of course know that. It's nothing here that is not obviously learned. I mean, the anchoring bias is exceptionally well understood. However, it hasn't really been described as such in the past. Only now psychologists are able actually to test things at individual level. I mean, they do tests kind of like this. So, very simple one, and I've just tested it recently with my family. First thing that you have to do with try to do this test is make sure a person doesn't know anything about a question being asked. That's quite important. So otherwise you are talking to a person that is knowledgeable and will get your right answer. But let's say you make a test and you ask a very simple question. So you ask, did Mahatma Gandhi live beyond the age of 140? First question. And second is, how old was he when he died? Now, if you kind of get random people, and this paper explains enigmatic anchoring effect, and you do that, you'll find out that the people generally give you a number that is relatively high. Now, in this particular case, it was still not high enough because I think he lived over 70, and but it's still kind of 67. Now, if you ask from the other end, when, did Mahatma Gandhi live beyond the age of 9, which is clearly not true as well, and then people give you a lower answer. And that happens everywhere. It's so prevalent. So obviously, just the question you give and the first page you give. I mean, the people in say, the car salesmen, and people in sales business know everything about the anchoring. They give you the picture of the car that looks good. That's why on the internet you have pictures of used uh, um, equipment that looks great, or the very flattering pictures of apartments. I mean, of course, otherwise there will be no business. It's not that they're hiding anything, they're just showing a picture that's seen first, obviously gives the right impression. Now you can start looking after, but too many people just get wowed effect. It's a clickbait mentality, right? And it's very, 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 very obvious. People make estimates by starting from initial value, and that initial value then adjusted to the final answer. So that initial value starting point basically allows a person who starts it an advantage. I can really see that advantage when, at work and so whoever sets up that anchor actually gets everyone around it aligned. Now, not aligned, but you kind of start from that price. You start from high, and then that means that people will walk from that down. If you start from a low price, obviously you already don't have any benefits for yourself, and obviously different starting points yield different estimates. And it's actually been tested by the same pair, Tversky and Kahneman. So, for example, in participants had a wheel to select number between 0 and 10, and then they were asked to adjust the number up or down to indicate how many African countries in UN. So those who had high number gave higher estimates. I mean, absolutely unrelated situation, and yet basically that produces the very, very highly biased answer by people that is really completely influenced by absolutely fluke figure. I mean, it's an amazing thing at how this happens, right? Now, it's our natural tendency, and if we'll rely on the first piece of information we receive. And the framing is the way that this information is presented. Both can influence the framing is the way it's presented. So it's not exactly anchoring. They're also kind of qualities that also kind of biases of representation, but in different way. You can use these principles to help us communicate, and it's not necessarily negative. So here's what I'm trying to say. It sounds manipulative, but these are the ways that people communicate to each other. They put some anchors and feeders, and that means that other people kind of gather around that idea or thought by a person who set up the anchoring, and then they basically go somewhere. It's like you have to put some you have to make a first step, right? If you make a first step, you have made an anchor. The same thing is framing. Framing is basically giving the way the information is presented so that you can communicate. If the information is only presented in a code, let's say rather than seeing words, you will see the computer code of zeros and ones that sits behind the PowerPoint presentation. I don't think that actually allows us to move any further, right? So yes, some people really treat these things negatively. It's not the same. Now, it's not exactly the same as the representation bias. Representation bias is basically when you recall a memory or experience that is similar to a present situation. So you're basically making quick judgments based on some prototypes that already come to mind. It's also a bias of presentation that you see something, okay, say, oh, well, it's basically stereotyping. So it's a little different here. And it's also not active bias in a way, it's a visual one, whereas the anchoring and framing is actually caused by somebody that anchors you or frames you. And that's why sometimes this is perceived more negatively than, say, representation bias, because it's kind of, in representation bias, you don't have to blame anybody but yourself for a stereotype. In anchoring and framing, you say, well, we have been kind of led this way. And I understand it's, to be fair, there's a lot of malevolent, bad examples of, people intentionally misled. But you have to make a distinction between intentional misleading by framing something that is not there, not correct, into something that is, acceptable to people, right? Whereas framing is actually in a positive way. I mean, in business, you do it all the time. It's creating a certain story around which people could congregate. Now, business would say, well, I don't need stories because we are all about facts, and it is true. And I think it is true, but slightly misleading, because without the framing and anchoring, you actually can't move forward. And so somebody has to make that happen. And how exactly this is going to work, is working, I'm not sure, but well, I am kind of sure through my experience that this is always happens. When it says, framing bias is a perceptive error, it just occurs when people rely too much on how these things are conveyed and ignore the factual evidence. That is obviously an error. And I think this kind of statement does make it negative. And I think I'll try to explain two definitions of that framing bias, because yes, sentences can be framed positively or negatively. And it's not even sometimes the words, but also the tone and styles of the presentations being made. Now, you'll have to think, of course, imagine that somebody sells you a product as a bogus. So in financial and business decision making, you will just have to be thinking rationally and making a choice based on factual data. So you'll have to ask for evidence, right? That is true. And I think once it's kind of people sell something to you, and you have to say, yeah, give me the evidence that this works. So yes, framing occurs when people decide based on how the information is presented, and sometimes overlooking the factual data. And it is also true that this is very difficult to, well, it's actually impossible to completely remove, because the same piece of information is presented in different ways. Response varies. It's like half full or half empty glass, right? I think there's many examples of how this happens, right? So, and you can make this series of consequences, of course, and especially in business. So businesses are trying to kind of say, well, we'll try to remove this. My point to it, I think we'll have to ensure that we'll always stick to the fact and observations as much as possible. But remember, we cannot completely remove it. So anybody who could say, well, we are just going to have no stories and no framing bias, we will just stick to the facts, is also misleading, because they can't. I mean, it's a scam. I mean, you cannot not to communicate to somebody else. And basically, framing and anchoring are parts of the communication. Now, I think what it is it's my own definition here a little bit, is there is a mild case, an acceptable anchoring and framing, which basically sets up a tone in conversation so that a certain decisions being eventually made, and people look at the facts and people look at alternative models and then make a decision, but somebody made the first step. And a malicious anchoring and framing, when deliberately the information is obfuscated, information is not presented in the right way, so that to mislead. And I think these are different things. They're both sort of, when people frame things, and people anchor to something to start with, but one is not malicious and actually helpful, and the second is bad and malicious. So I think that's how I would frame that. See, I said how I framing, and how to overcome it. Let's say, it's already here, you're framing this as something, right? So how to, you kind of framing that something that has to be overcome. So, I think clearly we have to think rationally, because you can miss an opportunity when somebody, and like, for example, if somebody is presenting a product and presenting it in a very bad way, and not presenting it clearly, words are jumbled, and the overall quality of delivery exceptionally bad, and you are an investor, right? So you might miss an opportunity, which is really great. So you have to be perceiving through a thick of that poor presentation. And can imagine, in the scientific community, that happens a lot. For example, a professor doesn't have to sell anything, so he could actually speak very badly about the idea, but he can, it's basically a great research, and he demonstrated it, right? And alternatively, somebody who is exceptionally well presenting, but actually there's no data behind it, and you can follow that person both in business and science. So on the face of it, you'd say, well, I think clearly we have to get to the bottom of it, but we can't sometimes. And this is what I'm talking about, the steps, right? I think the first step is somebody's actually presenting something in a way. It's a bit of a I would say, a respect on the person who wants to present his idea to other person, because it's a communication. Basically, it's just a communication tool. You'll have to frame things so that people actually get attracted and are able to understand what you are presenting, so that kind of moves across the idea from you to them. But you have to stick to facts and observation. Ask for data. The picture is being painted all the time. They have to sell you the story, and they have to. I mean, there's other ways. It's really difficult, but you have to look beyond to connect the dots. Always be analytical. People should research their plans and think about things thoroughly, and do not rely too much on how things are presented, because they can present it extremely badly, right? And have a heuristic approach. Always ask questions about what's proposed. Ask many questions as you can, as you need to. Don't take shortcut. Avoid anything that's quick, and always, rather than short term, have a long-term perspective and understand how the ideas will come to fruition. So in a summary of those two biases, anchoring and framing, I'd say there are two examples. not two examples, sorry, two poles of it. You can't completely avoid it. You can be a mild case when you will be able to start a conversation by anchoring and framing, but so that people get together to achieve a certain goal, and then that kind of starts ball rolling, and then you stick to facts and observations to get through. In the second one, when it's a malicious example, when people are trying to obfuscate the truth and lead you to the wrong path, clearly in that case, we have to fight against these extreme examples of framing and anchoring. So yes, I think we can defeat it, but we can work with the inside ourselves to actually become much better critical thinkers. So this is all I wanted to tell you about framing and anchoring. Thank you.